Hi everyone, welcome to week 3 of SGS 303. We're talking this week about the idea of winners versus losers in globalization. The idea is that the sort of integration of economies throughout the world, global competition, perhaps particularly in the lower skilled sectors, has led to a division, a political division between people in terms of their support for globalization, right? So if we're looking for a backlash against globalization, see, well, where should we look? If we look at public opinion, one of the things that we'll find is that there's a split there. There's people who support globalization, global institutions, and international trade, and all those sorts of things, and there's those that don't. And so, obviously we wouldn't expect a backlash from the people who have been benefited or who support globalization, but more from those that don't. So that's the split that we're looking at this week, right? This division between these two groups of people, and who are they, right? Who are the well, we'll certainly see it cast in the context of who supports international integration and who doesn't. But we're looking at them in a very particular way, and we'll find that probably the answer to that question is who's been benefited by globalization and who hasn't been, right? And so that's not always the case, right? We're not always in favor of the things that benefit us, right? Or against the things that hurt us, right? Although that seems like it should be the norm, and certainly there's a lot of cases where that is in fact the case. That's not always the case, right? And so, but in this case, in the globalization context, right, that it does, as you'll see in the reading, right, it does seem to be the case that those who have the most to gain from globalization are in favor of it, and those who have the most to lose from it, or who have lost the most by it, are against it, and that seems like a good thing, perhaps. So you'll see that. Have a look across both papers and see, well, who are these people then? Who's been benefited from globalization? Who's not been benefited by it? And there's two different approaches that each paper takes a different approach to looking at this and to investigating this, but ultimately they're investigating the same question, right? As who are the losers and who are the winners, and how does that affect their support for globalization? And the first one is a general global approach, right? International public opinion, right? Not although it does break it down in one of the tables, it breaks it down into country, but really the paper's not really based on a country by country analysis. It's based on a general global analysis, right? So the other thing is that not only is it a sort of a general public opinion analysis, but it's also looking, what it also does is it doesn't differentiate between different types of globalization, right, or different areas of globalization. It in fact says, look, people can't do that. People don't do that. People are not doing that. The public are not able to distinguish between different elements of globalization. So, for example, different elements of globalization like international trade, international labor mobility, international capital mobility, and then of those different I suppose mobilities, right? International trade perhaps is the mobility of goods and services, perhaps. So you've got goods and services, you've got labor, and then you've got capital, right, which covers a lot in terms of globalization and what's moving around the world. So if you can't distinguish between those things, or you don't distinguish between those things, right, and then do you then distinguish between different types of international organization? And you'll find in the Bierce and Joseph Scott piece that they argue that actually there's no the sort of a very, very basic distinguishing between, okay, well, that's of the nation and that's of the international, right? And so migrants are not from here, right? And so immigrants who come here to my country, well, they're sort of international, they're from out there. Well, you know what else is from out there? The UN, right? Or the EU is from out there. All right, that's not from inside of here, right? So in that Bierce and Joseph Scott paper, you know, the only discrimination that people are making, you know, it's not between different international organizations, and they're not necessarily linking particular causes, like for example immigration, if perhaps they're worried about immigration and their employment status, the competition for jobs and that sort of thing. They're not really linking that with any particular international organization, perhaps, right? But just generally with international organizations, because immigrants are international, like international organizations. It's a very low level of discrimination that they're finding there. So that they're maybe assuming into their model at Bierce and Joseph Scott. So that's the one approach. The other approach that you'll see in the Hobbold piece is about, again, Brexit. Right? We've talked about Brexit before, but this is it's a big part of the backlash, right? You've got Trump in the United States, but Brexit. Those are the two, I think, phenomenon that people point to when they think about this backlash. And so we're looking again at the Brexit referendum, and Hobbold. What Hobbold's doing is saying we can look at what Hobbold's doing is saying, let's look at who votes against. Let's look at who votes against remaining in the EU. Let's look at people who are voting to leave. What distinguishes those people? Okay, and again, the finding is, right, those who are less likely to gain from globalization, those are less likely to gain from international competition, through migration, the opportunities and the threats that brings. Those who are more threatened than opportunized, I suppose. I don't know if that's a word, probably shouldn't be. But you know, the people, it's the losers, right, who are voting against it. The losers in globalization. And look and take notice of Hobbold. Like, how does Hobbold figure out who the losers are? Right, have a look at that, and have a look at how they operationalize the attributes of those who are losing out in globalization and are thus voting against remaining in Brexit. They're voting to leave the European Union. I think if there's one, you know, and this I think goes against something we learned before, right? But if there's one thing that I would take away from this, like one overarching, very broad, and this shouldn't be the only thing that we take away, but if there was one thing, it's like people seem to be voting along their interests. You know, those people who are losing out from globalization are voting against it, and those people who would gain from it are voting forward. And that seems like a very rational world to live in, and that's maybe that's encouraging, right? The way that it might be unencouraging is the way that it sort of differs from some principle that I think we learned from other readings, right? And it's this. You know, where it might be a slightly sort of negative thing is oh, you know, everybody's thinking of themselves, right? Everybody's just thinking of their own economic benefits, right? Their own economic interest. You know, and you might be discouraged by that or not, right? You might think that's the best way to manage society, right? Certainly, there's arguments, right, about, you know, sort of neoliberal arguments, right? That if everybody does what's right for them, then that leads to the best outcomes. So you don't have to be discouraged by that. But if you are, right, if you think, well, people are just selfishly voting in their own economic interests against the will of the greater good, or something, or against the greater good, or against the will of the, you know, against the interests perhaps of most people in the world, or something like that. That might be some sort of argument to think about, at least. But yeah, that's where it goes against. I think before we looked at principles where we looked at readings that said, look, people are not necessarily always voting in their own interest. I think it was this last week. People are not necessarily voting in their own narrow economic interest, but they're voting in what they think is the interest of people who are like them. Right? So not necessarily their own individual interest, but others who are like them. So that's something to sort of think about as you're reading this week, is how much of this in these two readings, how much is their own individual circumstances versus, and I think it's much more that in these two readings than it was before, when it was, I'm voting in what I think is right for people who are like me, which is it's a little bit different, but it's not a million miles away from voting your own self-interest, but it's a little bit different. Because you might say, well, my economic situation is actually is good or better than I'm looking for. Like it's improving even, perhaps. But people like me, perhaps, right? The people that I associate with, or the people that I just identify with, they're being hurt. And so while I'm okay personally, I want to vote in ways that are going to help those other people who are suffering, perhaps because because I feel some sort of affinity towards them, whether it's a national affinity or a racial affinity or an age affinity or something like that, right? Or other older people or other younger people. And I'm going to vote on behalf of, I'm not claiming to be personally young, but a young person might say, hey, I'm young and I'm doing okay. I've got things sorted out pretty well, but other young people who are like me, they're struggling, and so let me vote on their behalf, right? That's just an example. Don't read too much into that in terms of the quiz and that sort of thing, but this is not necessarily the young people who are at least according to these papers, that are being left behind, or that are the losers in globalization, but other that are the ones voting against the EU. So I'll leave it there. I think a nice brief introduction. These are pretty straightforward, I think, readings. Again, just to sort of sum up what you're looking for, look for how international public opinion is going against international organizations, including the EU, and what groups of people within international public opinion, which groups of people are particularly against globalization. And this is sort of the winners versus losers week.